We're still in the opening stages of that, but I think what the administration needs to do in an opening stage is to change the atmospherics. If you want to be able to negotiate, if you want to be able to step in and say, look, this is a new policy, we recognize that some mistakes have been done by the US in the past and now we have to rebuild our credibility, then you need to address the atmospherics, you need to address the people. And the president, I think, has done that in a masterful way. Going to the Muslim world, talking about American values, and talking also about mutual respect, which is critical. This is not a region that believes that whatever problems they have, they will benefit by being dictated to what they need to do. They are oftentimes ancient cultures, some of the first cultures of human civilization, that crave respect before they can do anything else. And particularly in the Iranian case, that is certainly true. The Iranians are extremely proud of a history of 3,000 years that they've had. They've been a regional superpower for most of that time. And they are seeking a somewhat equal footing with the United States in any negotiation. They are terrified of the idea of negotiating with the US as a weaker party. They want to be there as an equal partner. Well, it's rather soon to be able to say if it has resulted or not because the administration is still relatively new. But I think, again, on that point, it is the first steps that are necessary before you actually can have a negotiation to change the atmospherics. And what is important here to note is that the administration has moved very quickly towards changing the atmospherics, and they have succeeded to a large extent unilaterally to change atmospherics. It is not as if the Iranian government has been particularly helpful. And in fact, much of the change that did occur in the atmospherics was unfortunately undone by the way radical elements in the Iranian government conducted the fraud in their presidential elections, and perhaps even more importantly, the vicious and widespread repression and human rights violations of the Iranian people by the government of Iran following the elections. That has certainly set back the ability to be able to move forward. It hasn't eliminated it. There's still that possibility. But all that work that the president had done to change the atmospherics was given a heavy blow by the Iranians themselves. I'm not so sure if I would characterize the way the administration dealt with the Iranian election crisis as being soft-handed. Certainly that's been part of the criticism against the administration. And certainly there's been a lot of voices saying that the administration should have done more and they should have sided with a particular faction in the elections. I think President Obama realized early on that the crisis that was unfolding in Iran was one that probably could not have unfolded had the United States taken a much stronger position, had the United States adopted a position it had during the Bush era in which there was a lot of emphasis of threats and all options being on the table. Under those circumstances, we have seen now quite clearly the Iranian government and all of its factions tend to rally around the flag and close ranks. But once that threat or that perception of threat was reduced, the existing differences and disputes within the Iranian government came up to the surface. If the administration in the middle of that had suddenly taken a harsher position, it would most likely have benefited the very same elements that were beating up ordinary people on the streets in Iran. And the president, I think, wisely decided not to pursue that path. However difficult that decision may have been internally here in the US, in which at times we want to see action and we may not be as concerned about the immediate implications and consequences of those actions. For the United States as a superpower, not to act is a difficult thing for us to handle, even if that may be the best course to pursue. Not necessarily, because that's a rather different situation. Now we're talking about a situation that is already being dealt with by the Security Council. It is deemed by the Security Council to be an international issue of concern. And here the United States needs to negotiate together with the P5+1 with Iran. But that's different from siding with any particular faction in an internal battle. And again, I think the administration has made it very clear that they're interested in the negotiations, but mindful of the way how the Iranian elections have evolved, it seems like it's going to be a very tough path to pursue. Even if negotiations can start, it will probably be even more difficult now than it was before to be able to come to a mutually acceptable compromise and solution. Nevertheless, it seems to be the best path to pursue, however difficult it yet may be.
Are you confident that the U.S. and its allies will be able to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon?
I think preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon is very much doable. That is unfortunately not necessarily where we have put the red line. Particularly the Bush administration put the red line at preventing Iran from having a nuclear capability, which is a dramatically different thing. In many ways, Iran already has a nuclear capability, perhaps not a weapons capability, but it is very close, if not already managed to master the fuel cycle. So if it is about walking the Iranians back on the progress that they've made in their nuclear program, I see that as being very, very difficult. But if the objective is to make sure that we prevent Iran from having an actual nuclear bomb rather than preventing Iran from being able to build one, then I think that is fully doable. And there are plenty of instruments at our disposal that can be used, including verification and inspections by the IAEA that have not been fully utilized, that probably constitute the most efficient tools that we have to prevent weaponization.
And as far as sanctions and sort of the negative measures that might be taken, those would only lead, I assume, in your opinion, to backtracking and stalling of negotiations.
Well, it seems very difficult. I mean, we've had sanctions on Iran for quite some time, and none of those sanctions have achieved their objectives. Back in 1995, major sanctions were imposed on Iran. All US-Iran trade was completely eliminated, and the objective was to prevent the Iranian nuclear program as well as a couple of other things. None of that was achieved. In fact, we're facing now, 15 years later, with an even more grim situation than we did back in 1995, and yet the same voices that called for sanctions back then are calling for sanctions again. But it's a tool that so far has not managed to have a very good resume. Its achievements are rather poor. Diplomacy, however, is not something that has been fully exhausted. That doesn't mean that sanctions cannot play a role in any negotiations or in any broader policy. The shift, however, that I think the Obama administration is trying to make is to put diplomacy at the center and have sanctions being as one of many tools that you can use within that diplomacy. The policy as it was before was to put sanctions and threats at the center, and then diplomacy was something that was out there far, far in the periphery. That's the shift that the administration seems to be pursuing. I think in many ways Iran is not as big of a threat as we sometimes see it. It does not mean, however, that there isn't a significant potential for Iran to be disruptive. And in fact, there's probably a good number of occasions in which Iran exactly has been that. But I think you're right in the sense that if we only look at the rhetoric of Iran, it comes across as being far more powerful, far more threatening and capable than it actually is. When you take a look at Iranian foreign policy actions and their rhetoric, you actually end up seeing two rather different pictures. None of those pictures are particularly pleasant to look at, but they're still quite different from each other. And if we focus too much on the rhetoric, then we may risk falling into a trap that the Iranian government essentially has laid out, because they use their rhetoric oftentimes to deceive and confuse the outside world of what their actual interests and policies are. And that's a problem I think that in the past we often got ourselves stuck into. In fact, in previous administrations, at times there seemed to almost have been a readiness, a welcoming of engaging with Iran in a rhetorical battle. That is not the best of policies. I think letting Ahmadinejad or some of the people that are using the most venomous rhetoric stand there alone in using that type of rhetoric will do the US much more good, because it will show what elements are actually being disruptive and what elements are trying to be constructive. Well, Israeli-Iranian relations are far more complicated than meets the eye. There's a long history of collaboration behind the scenes between Iran and Israel. Back in the 1980s, it was the Israelis who were lobbying Washington to talk to Iran, to even sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric, however venomous it was against Israel, because the rhetoric was not reflective of actual policies. Now, of course, a lot of things have changed. Now you have a much more intense rather than symbolic battle between the Israelis and Iranians. I would call it a strategic rivalry for dominance in the Middle East. It does not mean, however, that either side's characterization of the other is fully accurate. There may be some truth in it, but they're not fully accurate. I would say that the likelihood of an Israeli strike on Iran is not as high as perhaps the Israelis want the US to think. It is a tool that oftentimes is used in order to put pressure on the United States, out of an Israeli fear that unless the Israelis are pressuring the US to be tough on Iran, the United States would start focusing on other issues. It would strike a compromise with Iran that may be useful for the US, for Iran, but not so useful for Israel. And as a result, one of the few instruments that the Israelis believe that they have at their disposal is to make the threat that if the United States doesn't take very hawkish action against Iran, the Israelis will. But even if the Israelis were to act on this rather unlikely threat that they're making, the consequences are probably going to be tremendously dire for everyone in the region, including for Israel. First of all, if the argument is, as the Israelis have made it, that Iran may have a secret program, well, if it's a secret program, how do you destroy it? Because you don't know where it is, it's secret. So even if the Israelis, under the best of circumstances, which is still an unlikely scenario, manages to destroy Iran's known facilities, they will still not have destroyed Iran's capability to rebuild it or to pursue an unknown program that they may be having. So even in that scenario, the Israelis admit that their action could at best set back the Iranian program 3 to 5 years. And after which the Iranians would bounce back and probably pursue not just the weapons capability or the technology that would enable them to have the capability, but actually a bomb in itself. You would have a very angry, vengeful, nuclear Iran 5 years down the road. The Israeli hope is that within those 5 years there would be some sort of a regime change in Iran in which a new government would come into place and not pursue the nuclear program. That is, according to most analysts of Iran, a highly unlikely scenario. The first victim of any military strike or any military confrontation with Iran is likely going to be Iran's already embattled pro-democracy movement. They will be the first ones of the internal opposition in Iran that the government would find an opportunity to get rid of in the case of a military confrontation with the outside world. Beyond that, even if a regime change were to occur, there is nothing to suggest that the next government would not pursue a nuclear program with the same dedication as the current government. Remember, this program that the Iranians are currently pursuing and which they froze for almost a decade is a program that the Shah of Iran, with the encouragement of the United States, started back in the 1970s. This is not a regime-specific program. To a very large extent, they have been marginalized by Iran. The power of these states have waned quite significantly over the last 2 decades. Remember, a couple of decades ago, Israel was considered to be a military threat to Israel, or at least have the capability. Today, because of a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, Egypt is not a threat to Israel. But even if it wanted to be, it would not be capable of being so because its entire military is based on American weaponry. Without American support, Egypt has no capability to be able to be such a foe. Now, I'm not saying this as if that's a negative thing, but it does show that much of the Arab regimes that are pro-American have become quite dependent on the United States, which makes it less likely, less possible for them to act independently of the United States, which means that the US has a lot of leverage over them. Iran is not one of those countries. The United States has very little leverage over Iran. And as a result, it is in a position, not only because of that, but because of other factors as well, to pose a challenge to the current order. That is something that the Iranians have now been doing for more than 30 years. The Iranians are seeking a far greater role in the region. They want to be recognized as such. And that is seen as a major problem by some Arab states, particularly the Arab states, that they themselves are having rather unpopular dictatorships governing them. Because the greatest threat that they see is a populist Islamic, political Islamic movement reaching their shores, because that would be an existential threat to their regimes. That is certainly the case in in Mubarak's Egypt, or in Jordan, as well as in Saudi Arabia. Well, the Iranians have shown a certain capability of being able to create problems throughout the region. And in fact, it seems to have been one of their policies that whenever the United States is unwilling to deal with Iran, recognize Iran's role, negotiate with Iran, their response has been to make it as costly as possible for the United States to pursue that policy of non-recognition. That means playing its cards against U.S. interests in Lebanon, in Israel-Palestine, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Persian Gulf, areas that are of vital security interest for the United States, in which also the U.S. is quite involved in, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are areas that the U.S. Has made it very clear it needs to stabilize, and it's seeking a way to be able to exit those arenas. Without some level of collaboration with Iran, that's going to be a much more difficult task than it already is. And those are some of the threats. That's the leverage that the Iranians are using against the US in case of an escalation of sanctions or even military threats. We don't know yet. The Iranians seem to be cleverly keeping some of their capabilities unknown, leaving the rest of the world to guess about it. But judging from the past capabilities and patterns that we've seen, is that the Iranians seem to have enough of an intelligence apparatus in these arenas in which they can use asymmetric warfare against the United States. Certainly when you talk to people in the US military, they believe oftentimes that Iran already has used that to a significant extent against the US at various points in the last 8 years. But I think a consensus would be, though, that whatever the capabilities are that the Iranians have, they have utilized only a fraction of them compared to what they can if there is a real confrontation between the US and Iran. Iraq is, of course, Iran's largest neighbor in the Arab world. It is a country that Iran, whether it was called Iran or whether it was called Persia, and whether Iraq was called Assyria or Babylon, has been a geostrategic rival of Iran for 3,000 years. Most of the big battles have been on that front between Iraq and Iran. So there is a historic legacy of these two countries having found themselves to be at odds with each other and having paid a very, very heavy price for their inability to find common cause and agreement. The latest example, of course, was the Iraq-Iran war, which saw 1 million people as casualties on both sides. This is a war that was the bloodiest war after the Second World War in the history of the 20th century. And it's a war of which the legacy of it is visible, both in Iraq and in Iran, for anyone who goes there and visits. Particularly in Iran, you will see a lot of people who are bearing the scars of having had chemical weapons used against them by Saddam Hussein's forces. Incidentally, chemical weapons that oftentimes were provided to Saddam Hussein by Western countries. From the Iranian perspective, finding a modus vivendi, an alliance, or some sort of a partnership with Iraq, the only Arab country in the area that has a significant majority Shiite population, in which Iran can use some of these ideological variables to find some common ground, is of utmost national security interest in order to avoid ever finding itself at war with that country because of the tremendous cost that would inflict on Iran. Some would argue that Iran has lost the opportunity to find a true friendship with Iraq. It has meddled too much. it has gotten itself too involved in factional Iraqi politics to be able to be seen as a benign neighbor who's out there looking for Iraq's integrity and well-being. Others would argue that Iran had no other choice but to do so. But from what seems to be guiding the Iranians is to avoid a situation in which Iraq would have a pro-American government that has very few connections to Iran, in which Iran would have very few leverages over because of the risk of such a neighbor once again being able to be used or itself agreeing to be a tool against Iran's position and role in the region. That seems to be a nightmare scenario for the Iranians, and they're essentially betting on every possible faction inside of Iraq to be able to have decent relations and leverage over them to ensure that if they come out victorious in the internal Iraqi infighting or internal Iraqi political process, whatever faction comes out on top should have good relations with Tehran. Well, I think, frankly, this past summer, actually, let me rephrase that for you guys. The June elections in Iran and the media coverage of that, and the ability of ordinary Iranians to use their cell phone cameras and rush off home, upload it onto Facebook, Twitter about it, put it on YouTube, and make sure that the outside world would actually see what's happening, has reduced the otherwise rather common misconceptions that exist in the West about what's going on in Iran. For one of the first times, we had a lot of eyewitness accounts with imagery to be able to put together the pieces of this big puzzle. What we're seeing, in my view, was a very popular, spontaneous uprising or protest against what was widely perceived as being widespread, obvious fraud by the government in order to ensure that Ahmadinejad would win re-election, in spite of overwhelming evidence that his popularity had waned and that there was significant support for the reformist centrist candidate Mousavi. What happened afterwards is also something we should not forget. It's not just a voter fraud. There can be differences of views on that, and there are some who are arguing that perhaps there wasn't full fraud. But what there cannot be any doubt about is that the Iranian government's brutal crackdown against peaceful protesters who were out there asking for their rights to be respected. These were clear violations of human rights in Iran, and it showed the brutality which the Iranian government is capable of using against its own people, and in fact against the very same people who started this revolution in Iran 30 years ago. Because this was not necessarily, as it was during the time of the Shah, an unpopular government battling the entire population. This was one faction of the government fighting another faction of the government, and that second faction of the government seemed to have had a majority of people on its side. This was an internal fight within the government that went beyond any boundaries that we have seen in the past, and truly showed the Machiavellian and brutal inclinations of some of the hardline elements in the Iranian government.
And reading the tea leaves, what may come of this all, in your opinion?
Well, one of the things that most likely will not come out of it is a return to the status quo. You have seen the Iranian government, particularly some of the elements that are not elected, truly delegitimize themselves in the eyes of their own supporters. This is not a delegitimization that took place against people in the diaspora who didn't view the government as legitimate in the first place. But people inside, even religious people, found what the actions of the government were to be fully delegitimized, and have now, as a result, put under question in their own minds the legitimacy of not only certain institutions of the government, but the government as a whole. It's going to be very difficult for the government to be able to rebuild that, particularly mindful of the fact that it has so far shown very little willingness to admit guilt, to apologize for errors, and to actually seek justice for those who have been victimized. On the contrary, The violations against the rights of the people of Iran are continuing and intensifying as we speak. I think the election crisis in Iran shows that it's important that for the United States, as it at some point begins negotiations with Iran, or perhaps let me rephrase that, the election crisis and the violence that pursued in Iran shows that it's important that in any diplomacy with Iran, the United States needs to think, of course, of its short-term security interests, which ranges from Iraq to Afghanistan to the nuclear issue to the stability of the Middle East as a whole, but also some of its more long-term interests, which is to make sure that it has proper relations with an Iran that respects the human rights of its own population. If we don't include human rights on the agenda in any negotiations, then we may run the risk of repeating the mistakes that we've done in the Middle East in the past, which is that we have working relations with dictators who violate the human rights of their population. And those populations then blame the United States for giving the external security for those governments to continue to do so, to violate their rights. That's the situation we have today in Egypt, in which a large part of the population tends to be very anti-American. Same thing is true for Saudi Arabia. And same thing was true for Iran under the Shah. Now, for 30 years, we've not had a relationship with Iran. We may be going in a direction in which we can have that, but it's important to learn that lesson, that you never really secure your long-term security interest if you don't include human rights on the negotiation agenda.